Yeah, that's a really good question. Under the Seasonal Agricultural Workers Program, because it was a bilateral program, government to government program, recruitment was carried out by ministries of labor. And it continues to, and those ministries of labor continue to be involved with recruitment. And, you know, that was one model, and there's things that are problematic about that model. But what happened with the pilot program was that because it's just a unilateral piece of immigration policy that lets approved employers hire workers from any country of the world, that recruitment piece got taken out. So overnight, this industry of agents, you know, came out of the woodwork, and people have paid between, you know, $3,000 to, I think the most I ever heard was $15,000 to get a job in Canada under the pilot program. And those, so the government puts this program in place, takes the recruitment piece out, and does nothing to regulate it. So that, you know, some of the other presentations that I've done have talked about the ways in which the pilot program has really grown the illegalized workforce in Canada. Because, you know, people paying, let's say, $10,000 for a job in agriculture, they come to Canada, they realize there's no way in my contract length that I'm going to make up that money that I mortgage my farm in Thailand to pay for. So they, you know, skip out of their contract, they leave their employer and find work underground. So there, you know, there have been steps made to try and regulate recruitment, but this hasn't been like a federal initiative. It's been led by the provinces. So Manitoba came up with the Worker Recruitment and Protection Act, and that all employers of migrant workers have to register with the provincial government because it's a federal government. So by registering, the province knows who's employing temporary workers, and all the agents have to, the labor contractors also have to be registered. They pay a bond so that if something happens, there's a fund to which, you know, to compensate people from. And, you know, a number of provinces are starting to do their own initiatives, but we still don't have something at the federal level, you know, a concrete workable piece of legislation at the federal level. There is this blacklist that employers who, you know, violate conditions of the contract can be put up on this blacklist, but it remains empty, despite the fact that people like the Alberta Federation of Labor, they know how many complaints have gotten in and how many employers were found to be in violation, yet this blacklist remains empty, unless that's changed.
Okay. I come from a small family farm background, and also I have been a migrant worker in the US when I traveled and worked in horticulture. But I just want to kind of bring together a couple comments that have come up, and this is sort of taking another direction, but it refers to the hours worked by people. And I know from my background I've worked, you know, the 12, 15 hours, 7 days a week sort of work shift and not been alone in that as citizen workers. And I'm just wondering if there are more and more regulations on, say, amount of hours you can work, how will that change potentially, say, even conventional and citizen workmanship in agriculture, and maybe force the small farmer into going, say, these large factory farms, if people want to call it that, but again, decreasing the number of viable small farms?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what, you know, if I speak from a migrant worker's perspective, migrant workers, you know, it's not that they necessarily want legislation around hours, but they want to feel that they have the power to say, I don't want to work 76 hours a week, thank you very much, when they're getting too tired. Or, but I think a really good example and point is when UFCW, you know, the first contract at Mayfair Farms in Manitoba that involved temporary visa workers and citizen workers, and there was a piece in there about overtime, and the temporary foreign workers said, well, we're not signing it, because if overtime is part of our jobs, the employer won't pay us overtime. They'll just bring in another migrant worker to pick up those hours. And we're not interested in 40 hours a week. So they ended up, changing the contract to, you could have an option. You could choose. So citizen workers who have family members who have social responsibilities within Canada, opted for the overtime, and migrant workers, I don't know, perhaps not all of them did. But, from a migrant's perspective, it's the ability to say, I don't want to work tonight, or I don't want to work 76 hours, or I do need a day off, which they currently don't have.
It was actually the other way around. They signed and voted for a contract that allowed them up to 76 hours a week. After the 76 hours a week, they would get a dollar increase. And the employer refused to pay anything over $76 or 76 hours. So they got no work more than the 76 hours because the farmer refused to pay the extra dollar.
Mm-hmm. But the contract has the two options, is that?
No, there was, anyone could work up to the 76 hours. Anyone worked over and beyond that got the $1 an hour bonus.
Mm-hmm.
And the farmer refused to pay anyone the bonus time. And so the workers got mad and actually decertified the union because they weren't getting more than the 76 hours a week.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes. Dan.
My question is in regards to remittances. So, workers' attitudes towards sending money back home changed as a result of all these tensions that you talked about, such as, competition amongst workers and threats of deportation. So,
How does that affect the money that they sent home?
yeah, do their attitudes change towards sending money back home once they come here and have been working for a few months?
Well, generalizing, most people are here because they want to send remittances home. And, that's not speaking for all of them, but, generalizing, that is the driver for them spending, up to 8 months or maybe even 2 years under the pilot away from their families and their loved ones. So remittances is the big driver. And, this is why people will acquiesce to all sorts of conditions in order to be able to access those Canadian wages and send it home. And one of the things that I didn't mention today about the diversification, I talked about how the diversification of the workforce, breeds competition and allows, breeds more competition amongst workers and also sending countries. But it also allows more vulnerable workers, brings more vulnerable workers into the labor force. So for example, people from Thailand who have spent $10,000 to a recruiter to get their job, and also from countries from Guatemala. The difference, if you look at the human development indicators from Guatemala to Mexico, and the material conditions of the Guatemalan workers' families is so different. From there's poverty in Mexico, but not to the extent that there is in Guatemala. So, those workers are even more vulnerable than some of the other nationalities working under these programs. And, that really is the driver. I mean, some people, don't send as many remittances home because they establish, more of a social network here in Canada, and may over time send fewer remittances home. But by and large, people working on average for about 6 months in Canada send about $6,000 home.
I think I'm going to ask the last question.
Okay, sure.
Are there examples of other high-income countries that have gone another way on this, that have better legislation and higher wages for migrant workers, but in which the local war or local food movement has survived, the local farms have survived? Because I'm thinking, one of the most common rebuttals you hear to the kind of argument you presented is, well, local farms wouldn't be sustainable without these pressures on these, the pressures on the wages of migrant workers, without paying them half the wages of Canadian workers. But I wonder
Yeah, I don't know of like a good model. Ironically, the Canadian model is usually held up as the shining international, model of best practice. I mean, in Spain, one thing about, they bring mostly North Africans in to work, and that program actually has a path for earned residence. So that's very different to the Canadian program. The UK, the UK has a program that, I think if Canadian growers saw it, they would laugh, because it's so, it does not have the same perks from a grower's perspective that the Canadian program has, because it's mostly educated, students who are paying for their tuition that are involved in that program. But most of the migration into the UK is people from Eastern Europe, and they've seen similar problems with gang masters, and in fact have, to the extent that when those cockle pickers were drowned in Morecambe Bay, came up with special legislation around labor contractors. No, I don't know of a good example, but I'm going to continue to look for one. The Australian New Zealand programs were modeled after Canada's.